Good. Hello everyone and welcome. Thank you very much for making it back from lunch promptly, and hopefully you are here to hear us talk about high security and interoperable OAuth 2, otherwise you're in the wrong room. So my name is Joseph Heenan. I'm the CTO at Authlete, so we're one of the companies in this space. You'll find our booth downstairs. We make bits that developers can build authorization servers out of, and I will modestly say we are loved by developers.
I think you need to speak up.
Do I need? Right. I do have my mic on, so let me try speaking up. So yeah, I'm Joseph Heenan. I'm the CTO at Authlete. We're one of the vendors. We've got a booth downstairs. We produce authorization servers, or in particular components you can use to build authorization servers, and we are loved by developers. So do come and talk to us at the booth if you would like to hear more. And I have my colleague Daniel with me.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Daniel Fett. I'm working mostly on standardization stuff these days. So in the IETF OpenID Foundation, and in particular on the things that we'll be talking about today. So, what are we going to present? First of all, we like to discuss why OAuth 2 alone is insufficient for many high security use cases and what high security means. Also that it doesn't really provide interoperability. Then we'd like to introduce FAPI, and Joseph is going to do a bit of a deep dive into the details of FAPI. And then we'll briefly talk about the current status of FAPI. So is it available? Is it usable? Who's already using it? So let's go. So I assume that you have heard of OAuth 2. And let's say you want to create a new ecosystem for example, an open banking ecosystem, right? To connect banks with some relying parties that want to access end user data from banks. Or you want to create a new e-signing solution based on OAuth, authorization of signatures via OAuth. Maybe you are a regulator, and in your country, you want to introduce open insurance or open banking interfaces. What do? You know that OAuth 2 exists. So, and I've actually seen that in practice, that people just go and say, use OAuth 2. But that is not sufficient. And we'll see why that is not sufficient in a moment. It is especially not sufficient when you have such a high security case, when it's banking data, consumer data, electronic signatures, e-government. You cannot just say use OAuth 2. Or a variant that I've also seen in practice, use OAuth 2 and protect against the OWASP top 10. That is not sufficient. So what do you need when you have an ecosystem where you need highest levels of security and interoperability, because it is a large ecosystem, and you want to base that on OAuth 2? Well, first of all, for high security, you need high levels of security. How do you get that? When you look into that for OAuth, you will find a document that is called the OAuth Security Best Current Practice document. It's a draft document by the IETF, hopefully someday on its way to become an RFC. And in that document, the OAuth working group has collected years of experience from the use of OAuth 2 in practice, in high security applications and in other applications as well, and also results from research. So attacks that were found in academic papers, for example, and in general, all the other attacks that we know about, protections against these are all collected in this document. This document tells you how to avoid insecure options that OAuth gives you. And in general, it tries to introduce 2 layers of defense. So, for example, protections against stealing an authorization code. And if an authorization code is stolen, nonetheless, so then there should be another layer of defense, right? So to protect that authorization code against misuse. It's a good document. and I don't say that only because I'm one of the editors of that document. But the problem is it's 49 pages. It has over 68 musts and must-nots and many other requirements and recommendations. So it's really a lot of work to work through that. So it's not easy. It gives you all the tools, but still it may not be easy. Now, yesterday you might have listened to a talk by Aaron Parecki, who presented on OAuth 2.1. I see some heads shaking. And OAuth 2.1, roughly speaking, is OAuth 2 plus the security BCP, roughly speaking. So there are some other differences as well. The thing is, OAuth 2.1 is a general purpose profile. So it's really the next thing where you want to go after using OAuth 2, you want to go to OAuth 2.1. Probably you don't have to change too many things to do that. So it's a general purpose profile. It does not enforce only the high security options. So you can still use lower security options. Not necessarily insecure, but maybe also not sufficient for banking use case, for example. And also it is not an interoperability profile. In general, OAuth 2 gives you a lot of options. You select a grant type from 1 out of 4 in OAuth 2.0, less in 2.1. There are different types of authentication. There are different security mechanisms in general. There is cryptographic algorithms that you have to select for some of those mechanisms. And then, of course, also extensions that you want to use. For example, you might want to use the PXE extension for added security. So all of that gives you options. But if you want to create a large ecosystem, you don't want options, you want interoperability. So you have to select some of those options, but which ones do you select? And also, you will quickly learn that you probably want more features than OAuth alone can give you, especially in large ecosystems. So how do you ask for complex consent? For example, you want to authorize a bank transfer. So you need to ask the user that they should give their permission to transfer a certain amount of money from some bank account to another bank account using maybe some other data as well. So how do you do that in OAuth? There's no mechanism by default to do that. How do you manage existing grants? So say you already got permission from the user to read maybe one of their email mailboxes. Now you also want to read another one of their email mailboxes at the same, so governed by the same authorization server. How do you do that? And then there's a problem that sometimes comes up that is called non-repudiation. So ideally, or in some settings, you want signed messages that you can store away for audit purposes to later prove that somebody actually sent a certain message. And all of these are very common problems, but OAuth 2 doesn't give you the tools to address these. And then you may have interoperability, so you can select between all these options, right? You can write a nice profile. But will you have interoperability? Probably not, because you can write all sorts of things into nice specifications unless you have tested that people actually follow the specifications and you have tested interoperability, you will not have interoperability. So you need testing in large-scale ecosystems. You absolutely need that. It's not sufficient to just write down what people are supposed to do. You need to check that they are actually doing it. OpenID Connect has a nice series of conformance tests. It's a very successful program in the OpenID Foundation. But what about OAuth? You might not be interested in OpenID Connect. You might just want to use OAuth. You also might want to use some extensions that may not be covered by the OpenID Connect conformance tests. So what do you do? Well, there's no easy solution to that problem right now, except the one, of course, that we are going to present on. So you want all of these things, and you have solutions for some of these things. So Auth2 gives you authorization. OpenID Connect gives you the authentication part and conformance tests. That's good. Then there's Auth 2.1 that gives you the security plus the authorization, but doesn't really talk about authentication. Also gives you no conformance tests, and none of these things gives you the interoperability part. So that's where FAPI comes into play. What is FAPI? Well, FAPI used to stand for Financial API. Now it turns out FAPI never actually defined any API. It's really a Financial API Security Profile, so it was renamed to Financial API Security Profile. Well, we quickly learned that people are very interested in learning this and using this also in other contexts, because there's really nothing specifically financial about this. I mean, banking is a great use case. It's a high security use case. You need security there. It's clear. But you need that in e-health as well. So it was renamed to Financial Grade API Security Profile, keeping the nice acronym, right? But people were still not very happy with that, because it still sounds like, well, it's financial grade, so you can use it for banking. Can I also use it for my e-signing application? Yes, you can. So we just renamed it to FAPI Security Profile. I cannot guarantee that there will not be another rename, but let's see. So that is the FAPI Security Profile, right? And what is that? It's a security, interoperability, and feature profile for Auth 2.0. It's usable for all high security APIs, as I already said, e-signing, e-government, health, financial applications, whatever. It's completely agnostic to the actual API that you are protecting. And the current version of that is FAPI2. There's also FAPI1, which used some different settings to provide solutions for some of the problems that we saw. But FAPI2 is really the current version that you probably want to use. It's an evolution of FAPI1, so we learned things in between. We try to improve security, or in general ensure also that the security is better understood. We improved interoperability, and we also hopefully simplified the actual implementation. So there are even less options to choose from, and options that you get are hopefully easy to implement. There's really not one FAPI2 specification. It's a family of specifications. And we have, as a theoretical underpinning, so to say, an attacker model, which describes the types of attackers FAPI2 is protecting you against, which also implies the types of attackers it doesn't protect you against. So when you read that, you hopefully learn everything you need to know about the guarantees that FAPI gives you. Then there's the actual security profile. Getting to that in a moment. Then there's a couple of other documents as well, namely the message signing, the client-initiated back-channel authentication, or CIBA for short, and the grant management document. So the attacker model, as I already said, defines the types of attackers. For example, we say there's a network attacker, so we assume the whole network is under control of an adversary. So we have to take care that HTTPS is used everywhere, and that even somebody who plays a role in the ecosystem cannot influence other parties or hack other parties, right? So if one bank is compromised in your open banking ecosystem, you want the other banks to be still secure. That's all defined in the attacker model. The security profile is the document where you probably want to start reading. And if you only want to read one document, this is the one. That's really the do's and don'ts for a secure, interoperable Auth and OpenID Connect implementation. This is the one where you want to start reading. And then there's the add-ons. You can use them or not. That's your choice. Message signing, when you, as the name says, want to have signed messages. Then there's CBA, when you want to have decoupled interactions. For example, you have a call center interaction and you want the user to, or you want to authenticate a user that's only on the phone with you. And then there's grant management to handle grants and consents. For example, when you want to, or when somebody wants to revoke a specific grant, or you want to expand a specific grant, and so on. So that's the FAPI2 specifications, the family of specifications. And Joseph is now going to give you the technical details of what's in the security profile.
Thank you very much, Daniel. So yeah, it is going to get a bit technical from here on in. Fair warning, there are going to be some protocol sequence diagrams, and if I'm feeling brave, I might even try a little bit of audience interaction. So, so yeah, let's go into our deep dive. So we're actually going to now talk about, hey, what are the things that we're actually doing in FAPI that make it this secure? So as Daniel said, we've already got the security best current practices from OAuth. That's all incorporated, so that gets you all the stuff that that document gets you, mix-up attacks and all the other good things that the IETF OAuth working group have figured out how to defend against. And FAPI2 disallows a lot of the insecure options. So if any of you have heard from the implicit grant, you will know that that has been disliked for a long time now and has security issues. And FAPI2 uses, or it mandates what we call pushed authorization requests, which I'm going to explain a bit more about in a minute. And it also mandates sender-constrained access tokens, which, as Daniel said, is to prevent the stolen access tokens from being used by an attacker. And we'll talk a bit more about that in detail as well. So let's start with pushed authorization requests. So when we think about OAuth 2 without pushed authentication requests, so we've got the standard three-party flow, we've got a browser, we've got an OAuth client, we've got an authorization server. The client is going to create an authorization request to the authorization server's authorization endpoint. It's going to send that in the browser. The browser is going to send it to the the authorization server. The kind of problems you have with this is that's not an authenticated message. It's just a URL. If the user wants to just change a bit of that URL, they can. Or the attacker, of course, if they have the access, they can change that as well. And there are also various limits on size restrictions. So not really a problem in the OAuth world in general, but when you start to put things like, hey, I'm doing open banking, I want to initiate a payment from this account to that account, you don't want people to be able to change that. And it becomes quite a big message, and potentially you start hitting size limits in the browser. So, yeah, I can try that, sorry. Let's try that. Okay. No, I very much appreciate the feedback. Do shout again if I get too quiet, please. So now let's talk about the situation when we do have pushed authorization requests. So instead of the client starting the flow by sending something to the browser, it makes a back-end request to the authorization server. So that's protected by TLS and all the lovely things. And that has all the things that it would have authorized passed to the authorization endpoint via the browser. It gets back a request URI, which contains what we call a nonce, which is not a word that everybody understands and not a great word, unfortunately, but it's a reference to that information you just passed. It doesn't have any meaning by itself, but the authorization server can look this up later to figure out what we passed it. So we pass that request URI onto the browser through the front end, but because it's now only got the nonce in it, if an attacker tries to modify that, they just get an invalid request. They can't actually stick a different bank account as the destination or anything like that. And then the authorization server gets that request URI, so it gets the information that we sent it earlier, pulls it through, and that means we've got an authenticated message here. It's secure, it's done over TLS, it can't be modified, no limits on the size. You probably don't want to put gigabytes in here, but anything up to that you should be fine. and there's no information leaked by the browser, so if somebody gets into your history or something, they can't see which accounts you were making payments to or what your payment reference was or any of that stuff that we would like to treat as private information. Okay, so that's pushed authorization requests. So let's talk a little bit more about sender-constrained access tokens. So by a sender-constrained access token, what we're doing, we're adding some cryptography into the mix so that it's not just an access token, which we would call a bearer token that you can just present anywhere, and that's your authorization that lets you access an API. Now we've got some cryptography in the mix, so you cannot just take the token and present it and get the information back. So the first step is that the client needs to create a new key pair. So that would be a public-private key pair, so standard RSA stuff or elliptical curve, pick your choice. Then when the client, after it's got the authorization code from doing the step of getting the user to authorize the access, we've got the authorization code, we're going to exchange that for an access token, all standard OAuth stuff here. We pass the public key of that key pair we created, and we also pass an object that's signed with that key pair so that the authorization server knows that this is a key pair that's in our possession. It has a timestamp in there or something like that, so that even if attacker got that message, they couldn't replay it later and reuse it. So the response is pretty much a normal response to the client. You get an access token back, but the difference here is the authorization server has now bound the access token to that key pair and recorded the information into the access token so that the access token can't be used without you having possession of that key. So then when we actually want to make the resource request and actually access the API, we pass the access token pretty much as normal, but we also pass the signature signed with the key, again with some kind of timestamp so it's non-replayable. And the resource server checks the signature and obviously checks the access token and the permissions and all the other things you'd normally do. And if all is good, we get our API response. So what happens if the access token leaks? So the client can make a resource request. It can create a key of its own and put a signature on the resource request. Sorry, I started that wrong, I think, didn't I? So the top one is the absolutely normal request. So if we think about an attacker that has got access to the access token, so they would pass it without a signature, it would just get rejected. Even if they created their own key pair and put a signed object in here, it's not going to be the key pair that the server was expecting, so it's still not going to work. So this really prevents the attacker from using stolen access tokens. And if you've been following news for the last couple of years, stolen access tokens hit the news at least a couple of times a year, and these mechanisms are the ones that present it. So in FAPI2, you have two different methods you can use for doing these sender-constrained access tokens, and you have to make a decision as to which you use. Each has pros and cons. One is called DPoP. That's very much an application layer thing. There's just a separate signed object that comes as part of the request. We use JWK key pairs, just like OpenID Connect, and everybody else uses JWK key pairs when you're doing JSON web tokens. It even works for web app clients. You can do this because it's completely in the application layer. You can just do it in JavaScript. You can use web crypto to create keys that can't be stolen from the browser. And you just don't need any integration on the network layer. So if we contrast that with mutual TLS, sender-constrained access tokens, this is very much a network layer configuration. You do have to configure your front-end proxy to do things with TLS, which in some situations is not easy to do. In some situations it is easy to do. So this is where the trade-offs of do you pick DPoP or do you pick MTLS come into play. But it's just using standard TLS client authentication. Standard X509 certificates that I'm sure everyone is very familiar with these days. Doesn't have to be official PKI certificates. You want to do this with self-signed certificates, it absolutely works. That is much simpler than managing PKI if you don't already have some kind of public key infrastructure for signing certificates and things like that. And one of the advantages of MTLS is that because it's at that transport layer, the request is completely protected. Even if the attacker saw the full request, they can't modify it, replay any bits of it usefully, because the TLS just doesn't let you do that. And the other advantage of using MTLS is that you can also use it for the client authentication, which means you're kind of killing two birds with one stone, so to put it, in that you just have to worry about configuring your TLS certificates correctly once, and you can use them for both the client authentication and for the sender-constrained access tokens. So that can be a very easy developer experience for the clients, because it's just you put your MTLS certificates in and you're pretty much done. Okay, so that was a very quick go through sender-constrained access tokens. So let's talk about some other hardening in FAPI2. So one thing we do is we use asymmetric client authentication instead of client secrets. I'm going to come back to this. We use high security cryptographic algorithms, and we have recommendations about TLS. So saying, look, you need to use TLS 1.2. Nobody should really be using anything less than TLS 1.2 these days, and we have recommendations on the ciphers you should be using, because there is a set of TLS ciphers that are considered to be very interoperable and immune to various attacks that people have found out about in TLS over the years. And we require the use of PXE and FAPI2 as well. What that does is prevent authorization codes from being stolen, or prevents them being used if they have been stolen. It's the most important bit. So let's just talk a little bit more about asymmetric client authentication, because I've found that people don't quite get this when we start talking about it. So let's try a bit of audience interaction. Hands up if you recognize this screen. A few people, thank you. So this is the screen you get at Google when you are creating an OAuth client so that you can get access to Google APIs. So the one particular thing you'll see, it's giving you a client secret back for your client. It's giving you a client ID back for your client, and it's also giving you a client secret. Although it's called a secret, that would more precisely be called a shared secret. It's not a secret because the authorization server clearly knows what it is, as well as you. So there's multiple parties that have it. So is it still a secret? Kind of, but it is a shared secret. And when you use that kind of secret, so this is an example of a token request, you just pass your client ID and you actually pass the secret there in the request just as the word. It's obviously protected by TLS, but there's all kinds of ways this could leak because it's going through various layers at the client without encryption before it gets sent, and then at the authorization server side it's obviously come out of the TLS protection, and these things can sometimes end up in log files, debug traces, all kinds of things. So yeah, it's a secret, but it's not a very well protected secret. So what do we do instead? FAPI2 has two choices. One we'll call private key JOT, and one we call MTLS, which MTLS I already talked about a lot when we were talking about sender-constrained tokens. It really has very much the same properties here. It's a network layer, very simple for developers to use, basically. And if we contrast that with private key JOT, again, this has similarities to DPoP that we mentioned before. It uses JWK public-private key pairs. It uses a signed JWT to actually pass the authentication across to the client. And again, private key JOT has the advantage you can do it in the browser if you want to, whereas it's very difficult to get TLS certificates set up in the browser. And private key JOT doesn't need that integration on the network layer again, so if you have external gateways and things that don't like to do MTLS, or that your security team don't like you fiddling with, this is the option you would pick. So let's contrast the previous screen we had for Google issuing you a client secret with how you'd actually do this with private key JOT. So again, in the previous model, we had Google telling us, hey, this is your client secret I have generated for you. So if you contrast that with, hey, there's a public-private key pair in play now, obviously the authorization server should not be giving you your public key that you're going to use. Should not be giving you your private key that you are going to be using. Because private keys are meant to be kept private. They shouldn't ever be in the possession of a different party. So this means the model is flipped about. So instead of the authorization server giving me something that I'm going to use to authenticate my client, I'm actually going to give the authorization server my public key, telling it this is the public key that you should look for. That means I am authenticating to you. And again, that switch from the authorization server giving you a secret to me giving a thing to the authorization server I use to authenticate, that's where people sometimes get confused and it starts to trip them up and they think about these things in different directions and get themselves in a little bit of a mess. So in terms of using your private key to authenticate the client, again, this is an example of a token endpoint request. So you just passed the client ID as before, but we have a new parameter, client assertion type, which just has a very specific value that the spec says. And then we pass a client assertion, which again, it's a signed JWT. So again, hopefully most people are familiar with signed JWTs, but it's a way to prove that the client has possession of that key, and hence this is the correct client. Please let the client authenticate and do the things that client should be allowed to do. And there's various protection in here so that even if that leaks, the attacker shouldn't be able to replay it and do the same operation themselves. Okay, so that was asymmetric client authentication. So as Daniel mentioned, one of the fundamentals of FAPI2 was that, and Daniel did actually write a lot of FAPI2. We didn't actually mention this at the start, including creating the attacker model. And the attacker model was created before we actually created the standard, so that what was put in the standard was things that were necessary to defend against the attacker model, which means you don't get to the situation where people just throw their favorite mechanisms into a standard because they sound good, but do they actually make any difference? That's what we use the attacker model for, to see, does it actually defend against an attack that we're not already protected against? If not, then we don't need it. And then once we had the standard and that attacker model, we got the researchers at the University of Stuttgart to feed it into a nice mathematical model. They ran it through and said, proved that the attacker model and the security profile actually mesh together, and the security profile does protect against the attacks that we intended it to prevent. So this is very unusual for a OAuth profile. There is no other formal analysis of a security profile like this that I'm aware of. They did one for TLS in the IETF, but at the OAuth level, FAPI is the only thing that has this kind of formal analysis backing it up. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the interoperability advantages. So FAPI very much reduces the protocol options. So it only leaves you two choices for client authentication. Only leaves you a few choices for the crypto algorithms you'll use. So it only, if you want to get technical, it only allows PS256 and ES256 and another type of elliptical curve that I'll never get the acronym right for. So that really helps you get the on-the-wire interoperability, because there aren't that many choices. So if you get a FAPI conformant client, then there's a very good chance it will actually just work with a FAPI conformant server, give or take the few things that are still left as choices. And the use of pushed authorization requests also greatly improves interoperability, because before we had pushed authorization requests, what we were seeing was that people like that were building the open banking ecosystems and needed to pass information like social security numbers or source account numbers or destination account numbers or payment amounts. You obviously don't want that passed via the browser. And pushed authentication requests just gives them that way to push that stuff in the back channel instead before. And when we didn't have pushed authentication requests, they invented all kinds of custom APIs to pass these things and give you back a thing that you then use as part of your authorization request. And We don't have that now. We just have pushed authorization requests. You send the stuff in the back channel and we're good. So as Daniel mentioned, FAPI also has comprehensive conformance tests. So I didn't mention it at the start, but I actually wear two hats. I'm also the lead of the OpenID Foundation certification program. So I do know a little bit about the conformance testing and have spoken about it at length previously, but these conformance tests, they are absolutely in-depth tests. We've worked very closely with the FAPI working group at the OpenID Foundation to figure out what we should test, what we shouldn't test, what's really important, what things are you can kind of leave out, just to try and keep the test to an actual reasonable size. And OpenID Foundation run a whole program around this, so it's all very open and public. There's a test suite that's completely open source. The people that are conformant, it's all published on the OpenID Foundation website. So if you ever want to find a vendor that is FAPI compliant, that is the place you go. Look for the vendors that are FAPI certified. And if you buy a product from them, you've got a very good chance you're going to be able to configure it to actually be FAPI compliant. I have many war stories from banks that have bought products that are not FAPI certified and then tried to get them to pass conformance tests. And it's not a fun experience for anyone because, yeah, the vendors may tell you they're FAPI conformant, but unless they've actually got that certified badge, it's best to remain skeptical, shall we say. And I will pass back over to Daniel now to talk about the current status.
Thank you. Yeah, so now we've seen the inner workings of FAPI, so to say. I think the only question remains is, can I already use it? Is FAPI ready to use? Yes, it is. So, so FAPI1, of course, is already final and everything. But FAPI2 is also very close to being final. So we hope that around the end of this year, we'll have a real final version of FAPI2. But already it is, I think, very stable. So I don't expect any major changes. I don't really expect any breaking changes either. So that current wording in the or the real wording in the OpenID Foundation is an implementer's draft. That means that it is a stable version. So the implementer's draft doesn't change. There could be a new one, but it doesn't change. It also already gives you all the IPR protection advantages that you get from the OpenID Foundation specifications. So yes, you can use FAPI2. We have the conformance testing as well. And the final version is hopefully due soon. Here we have a nice map of adopters of FAPI. Probably it is incomplete, but these are the ones that A, we know about, and B, we can talk about. So there's, for example, in the US, FTX, and Canada as well. In Brazil, very big as well, Open Finance, Open Insurance. We have in Saudi Arabia, Open Banking, Australia, with two projects, so to say, the Consumer Data Rights Initiative and Connect ID as well. In Japan, it is an official recommendation by the Banking Association, and for example, the Minano Ginko Bank has implemented, I think, FAPI2 even, don't they? Yeah, it's FAPI2. In Germany, for example, we have that's the yes.com open banking ecosystem that implements essentially FAPI2, but also some of the open banking official PSD2 standards are close to FAPI1 or 2. There's open banking in the UK, also live since 2019, so quite a time already. And in Norway, for example, there's the National Health Network, Helsa ID. They implement, or they require the use of FAPI2 as well. Even in Russia, there's a version of FAPI1 that uses a different crypto algorithm for security reasons, I guess. Yeah, so it is being used. The question is, should you use it everywhere? Well, let's say FAPI2 is a shortcut when you want to have state-of-the-art security and interoperability, and you can really use that for all kinds of APIs. So it's probably a good idea to consider it for your application. There may be applications where you really only have short-lived tokens, where you have lower security requirements, then FAPI2 might be too much for you, because it really requires all the security mechanisms. So when you, for whatever reason, don't want to use them, then maybe FAPI2 might be too much. But really, it is it's not that much that FAPI2 adds, but you get all the interoperability, all the security, all the conformance software, and so on. So it's probably a good thing to consider it, at least. Yeah, so summing up our talk, our masterclass, as it is called, FAPI2 is the batteries included spec when you want to have high security in your ecosystem and need interoperability. We try to fold all the latest recommendations into this specification regarding security in particular, so you don't have to read through the security BCP and all the stuff. You do get really good interoperability, as good as it gets, so to say. There's really not much missing. You have to just select your client authentication method and sender-constraining method, and then you're good to go. You get the comprehensive conformance testing for free. So that's especially interesting when you want to run a large ecosystem and you want to test the participants in that ecosystem before they can go live. Then that conformance testing is extremely useful and saves you really years of work. There are extensions that you can choose from to enable use cases that are very common in large ecosystems, and we are already seeing worldwide adoption of this, and I'm pretty sure that we soon will add more colored countries to that map that we just saw. Thank you very much. We do have time for questions.
Thank you. So, the gentleman just behind Mike, yes, in the black shirt. I think you had your hand up first. Yep, go for it.
So thank you very much. Obviously, very a lot of it was very new to me. So I really enjoyed it. My question is: there's one of the biggest things that stands out to me is this proliferation of like private keys, as opposed to like pre-shared keys and like bearer tokens and secrets and stuff.
Yep.
I'm curious if the formal security analysis presumes that clients and other parties are able to keep their private keys private, or if there's contingency analysis of how do we detect when a key has been stolen, mitigate the impact, and otherwise like prevent, because some of these keys, like JWK, is not like quite long-lived. And if one got stolen, what else, like what other dominoes fall from that theft? So I'm curious if that security analysis includes that.
Yep, so let me repeat the question first, just in case anybody didn't catch it. So to try and summarize it quickly, there's a lot of private keys here that people aren't used to handling these. Did we really consider that in the TACA model? What recommendations do we have around the handling of private keys? And so on?
Yeah. So that security analysis presumes that the private keys are kept private. That is mainly because this type of model that we're using there cannot speak about temporal like connections between things. So you cannot model lifetimes in this model. Nonetheless, I think it is clear that coming from a pre-shared key to a private key, it's probably easier to keep or you may have a leak of both of them, right? And when your private key stored in some hardware or software security module, you have a better chance of keeping that private than your pre-shared key that you just have laying around as a configuration item somewhere. But yeah, so it's not in the model, to answer your question. That is a general observation that we had in this place.
There are all kinds
and if I may add, you get the property that what is on the wire cannot easily be replayed. So that is a property that you will find coming from the attacker model, where we assume that the attacker can read certain messages and could replay them.
Is that presuming like correct at checking?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's why we have conformance tests, so we can actually send messages that have bits missing and see what happens, and try replaying things and all that kind of thing. And of course, there is also a lot of guidance out there on handling private keys, so PCI DSS, NIST documents, and so on. And the advantage of a private key is you can shove it into a HSM, which essentially relieves you of a lot of obligations, because the key can't actually get outside the HSM and the hardware security model. So I think Mike Jones was probably next.
I would observe MTLS, where you have to distribute and install certificates, is clearly usable in closed systems where you can just mandate we must have the certificate. Describe ecosystems where DPoP would be used instead.
So the question, to just repeat it, is yes, there's all sorts of fun once you start doing TLS client certificates. You're having to have a certificate authority that signs them, and I think essentially, what are the alternatives to that?
So from my experience with a large open banking ecosystem, I can say that TLS can be a big problem, because in some settings, also the client is behind the firewall, and it can be extremely complicated for customers to get both their application and their network team to work together to set up the MTLS on the outbound leg. So that was really something that we saw in practice, and it was a lot of effort, or took a lot of effort to coordinate those teams when such settings exist. So I think the big advantage of DPoP is that it goes only in the application layer and doesn't touch the other layers. So I think the answer to that question is probably offering DPoP is a good idea when you don't know what networks your clients are in.
Yeah, and again, one thing that often confuses people is that you don't have to use these kind of TLS certificates that are signed by a software or a certificate authority. You can just use self-signed certificates, and it doesn't make TLS trivial to do in some environments, but it does save you a lot of hassle dealing with sending off signing requests and so on.
So there was a question somewhere.
Yeah.
The request ID that is sent over the browser, right? I'm assuming that is expected to be a one-time kind of ID, but still there is an expectation that the client is depending on the server request identifier generation algorithm, right? Are there any thoughts to secure the integrity of that particular identifier as it's passing through the browser?
Yeah, so the question is about the request URI that we mentioned that PAR generates with the nonce in it. That is obviously passing by the browser. It's not secure, and what would be the response to that?
The good thing is when you have a nonce, it's essentially a signed message. So of course it's not a signed message, but from the security properties that you get, they can leave the nonce as is, then it works. They can modify the nonce, but they don't know what to modify. They can replace the whole thing, so they can ask the server to generate a new request URI for a different request for them. But that's probably going to break later in the flow because your PXE values don't match, or your state or nonce don't match. So there's not too much that an attacker can really do. And of course, at that point, the client relies on the server actually generating a fresh nonce for each request. If the server doesn't do that, well, that's a problem.
I think we had one more question over here.
So there was one, and then there.
Yeah, so I think these will be our last two, I'm afraid, as we are pretty much at time. So,
so following up on the DPoP, just a quick clarifying. Using DPoP, you still recommend or require server-side TLS, right, for confidentiality?
Yes. So it doesn't replace TLS. It's just for the sender constraining of the tokens. But you don't need to do client TLS. Yeah.
and we had a question here. So, yes.
So my question is around the MTLS option. Even though you can do self-sign, what about the expiration of the certificate? That most time create problem when one certificate expires. You have to get the new certificate.
Yeah, so the question is, even though you've got the option for self-signed certificates, there is still going to be an expiry, there's going to be a need to rotate certificates, and how do we handle that?
Yeah, but you don't keep track of that. You just expire one day and you go to that.
So when you use it for the sender constraining, the lifetime actually can be a few seconds. Because the sender constraining only lives from the token request to wherever you use your token. So if you only do one resource request, you can have a very short-lived certificate in that place. If you do more resource requests, obviously you have a longer living access token, you do requests over a long time. You need to ensure that your access token lives for that time. Otherwise, you need to go back and do another request to the token endpoint and refresh your access token. And then you can also provide a new TLS certificate at that point. So you can do a refresh.
Great.
Refresh of the certificate.
Yes, you can provide a new certificate when you send the refresh token, get an access token that is bound to the new certificate.
Cool. So, thank
Because you can generate the certificate at any point yourself. So.